Hi there. We're now halfway through our dig down deep into the book of Ruth, so I thought we'd begin with a quick recap of the story so far. Chapter 1 began with a prologue, setting the scene for the story that's going to follow. It began with the words, "In the days when the judges ruled." Dark days for Israel. Days when they were turning away constantly from the living God to other idols and to other gods. And so God had to constantly discipline them through allowing enemies to attack them. And it was somewhere in those dark days of the judges' period that a man called Elimelech took his wife, Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and left Bethlehem, their hometown in the tribal district of Judah, to go to their old foe, Moab, in order to avoid a famine that had come upon the promised land. But once they're in Moab, we saw how disaster struck. First of all, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies, leaving her a helpless widow with no support. Then, 10 years later, once she has married off her two sons to two Moabite men, and she must have swallowed hard to do that, her two sons die too, leaving her now with two Moabite daughters-in-law. Without hope, without resources, without a future. And that's why we called the prologue a journey from fullness to emptiness. Elimelech and Naomi had been running from something, running from the place where God had put them, where God wanted them to be, where God had promised to bless them, running because they couldn't see how God was going to fix their problem, the famine. Here's a challenge to us. Is there any area in life where at the moment we're running from something simply because we can't see how God is going to fix it? Well, that short prologue then sets the scene for the story that we're following. Chapter 1 we called The Return, a journey from emptiness to bitterness. We saw how Naomi hears that the famine in Israel is over, so she decides to set off with her two daughters-in-law to go back to her hometown of Bethlehem. But on the way, she suddenly realizes how selfish she's being, taking these two young women with her when she's got no hope, no means of providing husbands for them in the future. And so she urges them to go back to Moab. Orpah does just that, doesn't she? But Naomi refuses to go. And in those most beautiful words in chapter 1, she says, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. And may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." And so the two of them had returned to Bethlehem. But Naomi was bitter. Bitter because of the bad hand that life had dealt her. So bitter that she tells the folk in the town not to call her Naomi anymore, but Mara. Bitter. This is how deeply bitter she is. This is the bitterness to which she sunk on her journey. But as they return, the author wants us to know there's a sign of hope, because chapter 1 ends with that they returned home just as the barley harvest was beginning. Aha! A sign of the hope to come. With God, there's always signs of hope if we look for them. Chapter 2 we called The Reunion, a journey from bitterness to hopefulness. And Simon Coe took us through this chapter and showed us how it was full of, quotes, coincidences. Don't you just love the coincidences of God? Well, in that chapter we saw how Ruth offers to go and glean in the fields. Gleaning, remember, was picking up the crops that had been left at the edge of the field when the harvesters had been through it, as commanded in God's word. And whose field does she just happen to end up in? But in a field belonging to a man called Boaz, a relative of Naomi's, whom either Naomi simply doesn't know about or whom she's forgotten about over the years. After all, when people get dispersed, families get broken up and links get lost, don't they? Even today. Now, as a relative, Boaz was in a position to help Naomi. In fact, not just in a position to help her, but in a position of legal obligation to help her. Because as the nearest surviving relative, he was the guardian redeemer or the kinsman redeemer. And Simon explained how this was the nearest surviving relative who had a duty to help the family in time of need. So the immediate problem, the need for food so they didn't die, is resolved. Ruth is going to glean daily in Boaz's fields at Boaz's invitation, and certainly at Naomi's encouragement, as you can see the cogs perhaps starting to slowly turn in her thinking by the end of chapter 2. So here's the journey so far at the halfway point. From fullness to emptiness, from emptiness to bitterness, from bitterness to hopefulness. I mean, still today, life can be like that at times, can't it? A journey through different seasons. And often stuff goes wrong, goes pear-shaped in some of those seasons. But what is important, we learn from this story, is that when they do, we don't allow ourselves to be consumed by bitterness, because with God, with our redeeming God, there is always hope, as chapter 3 is about to show us. So let me just end this brief recap with a question for you. Are you perhaps in a tough season of life at the moment? Well, if you are, please ensure you don't get stuck in bitterness. Turn your eyes to God. Give your need to God. And remember that with Him, our Redeemer, there is always hope. Join me in the next session to find out how that hope unfolds for Naomi and for Ruth.